Ask any gamer out there and they'll probably tell you that Doom is one of the most influential franchises in gaming, not only as it relates to the genre of first-person shooters, but within the medium of video games as a whole. And they'd be right. Doom holds an important and equally interesting place in the history of gaming. There are a million retrospectives out there that have broken down the genius design of Doom, as well as analyzed the cultural impact of the series and the ways in which it continues to influence games today. And yet, when people talk about the legacy of Doom, they are mostly referring to the gameplay of Doom games, not to their storytelling elements. I don't think it would be very controversial to say that most people wouldn't cite Doom as a shining example of the potential for storytelling that lies within the medium of games. In fact, Doom is exactly the kind of franchise that has built its whole identity on the idea of putting gameplay first and story second. And while there were some dark times for Doom fans during the decades that followed after the release of Doom 2, everything changed in 2016 with the release of Doom, a game that was part reboot, part reimagining of the franchise, and which is now referred to as Doom 2016. After Doom 3's departure from the design ethos that drove the original Doom games, featuring instead a slower-paced gameplay, focus on survival horror elements, and a greater emphasis on narrative, as well as the cancelled Doom 4, which would have drawn heavily from conventional AAA shooters of the time, Doom 2016's goal was to take the franchise back to its roots by doing away with the narrative-driven AAA experience that had become the norm at the time, while emphasizing a brilliantly polished gameplay loop above all else. Doom 2016 actively went against the trends that dominated the AAA gaming landscape, opting instead to look back at the original Doom games for inspiration. And yet, at the same time, Doom 2016 took the formula of its predecessors and modernized it to fit a more contemporary gaming audience. Thus, Doom 2016 was both a return to a glorious past as well as a look towards a future full of new and exciting possibilities. But what about the storytelling side of things? Is the story of Doom 2016 as trivial and inconsequential as that of the original Doom games? Or does this new reimagining of the franchise manage to bridge the gap between gameplay and storytelling in a way that Doom had never been able to do before? Well, the thing that I find so fascinating about this topic is that despite the fact that Doom 2016 seems to have been built on the idea of doing away with story in order to go against the narrative-driven AAA trends of its time, this is also a game that, ironically, features a brilliantly crafted story that's better than what you'd find in your average AAA game. The truth is that Doom 2016's style of storytelling left a big impression on me from the moment I first played it back in 2016. And for a long time now I've been wanting to revisit this game and unpack why I think this is the case. While it's arguable that when taken as a whole, Doom 2016 ultimately fails in its attempts to tell a cohesive story, this game has stood out to me because it employs a lot of really smart storytelling techniques in order to tell a well-written story that is as compelling as it is subtle, which allows the game to do what Doom games do best: center its gameplay above all else. And so, in this video, I want to look at the ways in which Doom 2016 so smartly manages to weave a story around its gameplay-driven experience, creating in the process one of the most compelling examples of great storytelling that I've ever experienced in any AAA game. However, before I get into it, I wanted to mention that the thing that inspired me to go back and replay Doom 2016 for the purpose of this video was a documentary by YouTube channel Noclip, in which they interviewed many of the people behind Doom 2016's development around the time of the game's release, diving deep into the many parts that comprise the game and how they came to be. Although I have casually watched my fair share of interviews, analyses, and retrospectives on Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal over the years, I had never come across this particular documentary before, and hearing the developers talk about the process behind the creation of Doom 2016 reignited my long-time obsession with this game. As such, I will be referencing this specific documentary all throughout this video. I know I'm kind of late to the party when it comes to the subject of discussing and analyzing Doom 2016. The Noclip documentary in question is 7 years old now, and the topics that I am covering in this video are anything but new. As I mentioned at the beginning, Doom is one of the most influential franchises in gaming, and as such, every game in the series has already been dissected and analyzed to oblivion through a number of different lenses. The truth is that I've never been a hardcore Doom fan, or even a hardcore first-person shooter fan, and yet Doom 2016 is a game that has been floating in my mind for years now, and watching the Noclip documentary rekindled my interest in the game, as well as my desire to go back and re-experience it again in order to explore the ways in which it tells its story. Doom 2016 is probably one of the most interesting games within the AAA landscape of the past decade. And I want to take this opportunity to finally go back and break down the reasons as to why the story elements of this game have made such a deep impression on me, to the point that I still obsess about it years later.
They are rage, brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear, until it is done.
Okay, so here's why I find the Noclip documentary so interesting. It seems to me like there's a sense of contradiction to the way in which the developers of Doom 2016 talk about the story of the game. On a surface level, both Marty Stratton and Hugo Martin, who served as game director and creative director respectively, talk about the role that the story of the game had within the development process of Doom 2016 in a very simple way. Mainly that story didn't have a role in the game's development at all. This seems to be the biggest takeaway from the sections in which the topic of story is brought up. The developers emphasize over and over how important it was to center the gameplay above all else when designing the game. By their own admission, the story was something that they continuously struggled with. We are told that the story of the game was constantly getting in the way, and that it was being constantly pushed back to the point that it was the last thing to fall into place. In other words, the story of Doom 2016 was, at worst, getting in the way of the game's development and, at best, being hastily worked on near the end of the project. And this makes sense, as one of the main ideas driving the development of Doom 2016 was to do away with the vision of AAA narrative-driven experiences that had become common at the time, in order to return to that glorious age where gameplay came first. That was, after all, the reasoning behind the team's decision to cancel the original project that would have become Doom 4, giving way for Doom 2016 to rise in its place instead. During the sections of the documentary that cover the cancelled Doom 4 project, the developers used the following words to refer to this failed attempt at creating the next Doom game. Doom 4 was cinematic. It had more story. It was more realistic. It had scripted character interactions and more connections to the world. Martin says of Doom 4 that, quote, "To tell a bigger story, it sacrificed the Doomslayer. And Doom is about one guy involved in big things, and Doom 4 was more about the big things." These are the words used to describe Doom 4. Cinematic, story, realistic, scripted, character. And all of these concepts, the developers tell us, are antithetical to the identity of Doom. One notion that keeps being mentioned over and over again throughout the documentary is that Doom 4, quote-unquote, didn't feel like Doom. And so this is what Doom 2016 tried to distance itself from. If Doom 4 sacrificed gameplay to tell a bigger story, then it follows that Doom 2016 must then sacrifice story in order to make a better Doom game. At one point, Hugo Martin says that he loves quote-unquote story games, that he plays them all the time, but that this approach wasn't right for Doom. Doom, in other words, is not a story game. Thus, the main philosophy driving the design and development of Doom 2016 was a desire to do away with the trends that dominated the AAA industry at the time and which revolved around creating big, narrative-driven gaming experiences. But it's not really that simple because, as I mentioned before, there is a sense of contradiction to the way in which the developers of Doom 2016 talk about story. We are told that Doom 2016's design was born out of a direct reaction to the AAA conventions of the time, as they were present in the failed Doom 4 project. We are told that this approach didn't work for Doom, that it didn't feel like Doom. We are told that Doom is not a story game. And yet, what I find truly interesting about this discussion is that the way the developers talk about the story of Doom 2016 actually aligns with and unwillingly supports one of the fundamental problems that I've had with the AAA industry for a very long time. And it all comes down to the question of what exactly constitutes a story game. It has become the norm for AAA developers to make casual, more narrative-driven experiences because they have the widest appeal possible. This in itself is not necessarily a problem though. The real issue is that the AAA industry seems to believe that the only way to go about creating a narrative-driven video game experience is by employing traditional storytelling elements that don't particularly fit well with the medium of games, which is why AAA games often end up having to separate gameplay segments or levels, where most of the gameplay takes place, from story-driven sequences that do the bulk of the narrative work through more traditional storytelling elements, such as the use of repetitive dialogue structures or non-interactive cutscenes that resemble scenes from a movie more than anything else. This is exactly the type of game that Doom 4 was going to be, and that Doom 2016 was explicitly trying not to be. Doom 4 was going to be cinematic, full of scripted sequences and cutscenes and dialogue and action set pieces, etc. At one point during the documentary, we are even told that an earlier version of the opening level of Doom 2016 itself contained a long narrative setup that involved a lot of exposition and a backstory dump, along with an overly long tutorial. Eventually, this version of the opening level was scrapped because it didn't feel right. The developers didn't want Doom 2016 to be a conventional AAA story game. And to be fair, I think that the developers of Doom 2016 are right in saying that narrative-driven AAA games are usually built around the storytelling conventions that I just listed. But in wanting to do away with these story elements, in wanting to do away with things like scripted sequences and cutscenes filled with exposition and dialogue, the developers of Doom 2016, much like the AAA gaming industry itself, seem to conflate this particular set of narrative conventions with the notion of making a story game. In other words, it seems to me like the developers of Doom 2016 believe, just as the AAA industry does, that you cannot have a story game without also having scripted sequences and cutscenes and exposition and dialogue and all of these other things. And so, as much as the developers of Doom 2016 desire to go against this type of narrative-driven game, they end up subscribing to this same idea that you can either have a game that puts the story front and center, or you can have a game that prioritizes gameplay above all else, but not both. You can either sacrifice the gameplay for the sake of the story, or you can sacrifice the story for the sake of the gameplay. You can either make a story game, or you have to do away with story. And yet, the irony in all of this is that Doom 2016 itself disproves this notion, because I'd argue that Doom 2016 is not only a great story game, but it's a game that contains one of the best written stories that I've ever experienced in any AAA game.
Cannot determine the cause of the demonic invasion until the Resop satellite is brought back online.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Samuel Hayden. I'm the head of this facility. I think we can work together and resolve this problem in a way that benefits us both.
As I said before, the reason I find the Noclip documentary so fascinating is because there seems to be a sense of contradiction in regards to the place that storytelling occupies within the identity of Doom 2016 as a whole. And nowhere is this contradiction more noticeable than during the developers' discussion and breakdown of the game's iconic opening level, which has captivated players since the game's release. As the developers tell us in the Noclip documentary, the opening level of Doom 2016 was built in such a way so as to communicate the game's core design philosophy in a subtle yet clear manner to the player. They also tell us that this particular level went through a lot of iterations during the development process. At one point, it contained convoluted narrative setups filled with exposition to lay down the story for the player, not to mention a cumbersome tutorial that introduced the game's mechanics slowly. In other words, the level worked like the average intro level that you'd find in any given AAA game. Eventually, however, the developers stripped the level clean, wanting to put the player into the game as soon as possible with little to no intrusion from either story or tutorial elements. Marty Stratton mentions that this was a, quote, pretty risky choice, a pretty bold decision to say, we're gonna start lore exposition like every other game does, and then we're gonna just throw it away. Stratton is alluding here to the well-known moment when the Doomslayer shoves the monitor away from himself, cutting off Samuel Hayden's early attempt at an exposition monologue. And so, in terms of gameplay, Doom 2016's opening level is very lean. It does away with involved story setups and puts you straight into the action so you can start killing demons right away. A move that broke away with established conventions enough to make the developers worry about how players would receive it. But the reason I find the discussion of the opening level in the Noclip documentary so interesting is because, once again, I feel a sense of contradiction in the way the developers talk about it. Specifically, in the way in which they talk about the story elements present in this level. I think that the developers of Doom 2016, and Hugo Martin in particular, talk about the story in the opening level in two different, seemingly opposite ways. At times, they seem very aware of all of the brilliant choices they made while crafting the story of this particular level. At one point, Martin calls the story sophisticated, but in a more subtle way. He mentions that he believes in simple design and in saying everything with as little as you possibly can. There's a moment in the interview that I like a lot where he compares Doom 2016 to two movies, Sicario and Terminator, pointing out that because in these movies the protagonists say so little, every word that they do say and every action that they take matter a lot. In other words, when you have this kind of subtle style of storytelling, every little detail counts. Similarly, the developers of Doom 2016 wanted the player to hang on to every little gesture made by the Doomslayer. But this idea can be applied not just to the Slayer himself, but to the narrative style of Doom 2016 in general. There are so few story elements present in the game that every little detail that is there ends up doing a lot of work. And I completely agree with all of this. The story in the opening level of Doom 2016 is very subtle. It's conveyed to the player in a very show, don't tell manner, and so every little detail that we get is charged with meaning. However, the genius of Doom 2016 lies in the fact that having a sparse, subtle narrative style where the story is conveyed through only a few elements and details is not enough in and of itself. This kind of storytelling can only work if the writing is smart enough to be able to pack those few story elements full of meaning and depth. And yet, at other times, the developers have a very different perspective on the story of Doom 2016. Both Marty Stratton and Hugo Martin seem very dismissive and self-deprecating in regards to the story present during the opening level, not to mention the overall story of the game as a whole. At times, I even feel like Martin comes off as embarrassed when talking about story. He keeps using the word ridiculous to refer to the game's story, going as far as to call it juvenile. We are constantly told that we are not supposed to take it seriously, that Doom is meant to be fun. Martin says, when discussing some story elements, that, quote, "We wanted people to exhale and be like, let's just have fun. We know this is ridiculous. Can we just have fun?" And Stratton, when talking about the ways in which the opening level departed from conventional intro levels of the time, says that, quote, "We want the player to know that we know that they're there to play a Doom game, and they're there to kill demons. It's a wink and a nudge to say, we're throwing the story straight out, and you're here to kill demons, so go kill demons." The developers go out of their way to constantly reiterate how important it was to put the player into the game as fast as possible so that they can start killing demons right away. Killing demons is the story, as they put it. So which one is it? Is the story of Doom 2016 carefully crafted with intent, or is it just a throwaway part of the whole game that players are meant to ignore for the sake of fun? Well, despite the fact that Hugo Martin does make some positive comments when discussing the story of the game, it seems to me that, as I mentioned before, the overall tone that the developers use towards the story of Doom 2016 is dismissive, with a self-deprecating hint of humor. After all, we're told that they struggled constantly with the story, that it was getting in the way, that it was the last thing to fall into place, that it's not meant to be taken seriously, etc. In other words, the story just wasn't important during the game's development. It was something that was cobbled together at the end. The story of Doom 2016, to put it simply, was an unavoidable sacrifice that had to be made in order to center the gameplay above all else. Doom 4 was a story game. Doom 2016 is not. That's the whole point behind the design philosophy that drove the development of the game. But here's the thing. What if I told you that the story of Doom 2016 is actually brilliantly crafted?
He cannot be allowed to leave this place. He would ruin everything.
I'm willing to take full responsibility for the horrible events of the last 24 hours, but you must understand. Our interest in their world was purely for the betterment of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
Let's look at one of the earliest and most important cutscenes of the game, which takes place during the opening level. Like I mentioned before, it was really important for the developers of Doom 2016 to put the player into the game as quickly as possible, and so they tried to keep story cutscenes at a minimum during the first level. The game begins with the Doom Slayer awakening from a deep slumber. After taking control immediately and killing 3 demons right away, we watch a very brief conversation that gives us a little bit of characterization for the Slayer. Then we step into the second room of the game, where the Slayer finds his iconic suit waiting for him. And it is at this moment, right after the Doom Slayer puts on his armor, that we get a brief cutscene in which Samuel Hayden, the game's main antagonist, makes contact with the Slayer for the first time and tries to explain to him how and why things have gone to hell, quite literally, in the UAC facility, to which the Slayer responds by shoving the monitor away from himself and completely ignoring Hayden before silently moving on. Now, a lot of people, including Hugo Martin himself during the Noclip documentary, talk about this short interaction between the Doom Slayer and Samuel Hayden as a kind of inside joke between the game and its audience. Here's the player trying to just get to the game so that they can start killing demons. But then here comes Samuel Hayden all like, wait, let me give you all this story stuff first before you go. And then the Slayer is like, no thanks, and shoves the monitor away because the Slayer, like the player themselves, just wants to get on with the demon killing part of the game. The way Martin describes it, I get the sense that this scene is a nice little commentary on the creative impulse that drives the vision of Doom 2016 as a whole, that of putting gameplay before story, which in turn can be interpreted as an incisive criticism of the AAA landscape as a whole. And while I agree that this moment can indeed be read as a nice little joke, it is also so much more. See, the irony in all of this lies in the simple fact that this brief sequence is a brilliant example of well-crafted storytelling because of how much narrative work it does without doing a lot of narrative work. In fact, I'd argue that this is probably one of the best openings in any AAA game ever, not because it does away with story, but because it succeeds at setting up the story in a compelling way without getting in the way of the game itself. This brief cutscene is the very first interaction that we see take place between Samuel Hayden and the Doom Slayer. And how does it go? Well, Hayden immediately tries to spin his bureaucratic web of lies and BS in an attempt to control the narrative and manipulate it to his favor. And the Slayer, by contrast, immediately shoves the monitor away from himself, showing us that he is a person of action and is not interested in any of Hayden's lies. This brief interaction, as simple and bare bones as it is, does an amazing job at setting up the personalities of the two central characters of the game, as well as showing how each is a foil for the other, and in the process, the game sets up the main tension of the story. I'd argue that, at its core, the story of Doom 2016 is a story about the Doom Slayer and Samuel Hayden, two characters who are opposites to one another, but who nevertheless must work together to stop an evil army of demons while also being inevitably fated to clash against each other in the end. As such, instead of relying on long exposition-heavy cutscenes to set up a convoluted, expansive storyline, Doom 2016 focuses on outlining the personalities of its two central figures in order to show us in what ways they are opposites to one another. This is a smart way to introduce us into the game for a very simple reason, and that is that, as I just mentioned, ultimately, the story of Doom 2016 is not about what happened in the UAC facility before the Slayer awakened, and neither is the story just about killing demons. The story of Doom 2016 is about the conflict that exists between the Doom Slayer and Samuel Hayden, two irreconcilable figures who find themselves on an unavoidable collision path. In this way, this initial interaction sets up the two central characters and, in doing so, establishes the stakes of the story, which are then reinforced again soon after. A bit later into the first level, we get what is possibly the most famous sequence of the entire game. After dealing with a room full of imps, the Slayer gets into an elevator. Once there, Hayden attempts to make contact with him again, telling the Slayer that he is willing to take full responsibility for the events of the last 24 hours, which we immediately know is nothing but a pile of dog poop, before asserting that everything he did for the benefit of humanity. As Hayden is saying this, however, we see the Slayer glance over at a corpse next to him, which prompts him to angrily smash the elevator's intercom, cutting off Hayden once again, and the screen fades into the main title. The elevator cutscene reinforces what the previous interaction already established. It sets up the two main characters of the game in a way that outlines the central tension of the story. Samuel Hayden is a soulless CEO type of character who doesn't really care about anything other than the bottom line. Despite his comment about taking full responsibility, or perhaps because of it, we immediately and intuitively understand that the well-being of humanity is the least of his concerns. But we also understand that Hayden is someone who is cunning, and that he will try to spin the narrative to his favor by any means necessary, even when the evidence to the contrary, which takes the form of a dead body in this case, is staring us right in the face. The Slayer, by contrast, is unmovable. He is not interested in and will not be swayed by Hayden's lies. And his single action of smashing the intercom in anger speaks volumes about who the Slayer is and what his motivations as a character are. Like Martin himself said, we latch onto every small gesture that the Slayer makes and we draw meaning from it. When I first saw this iconic elevator sequence, I was amazed at how concisely it conveys meaning to the player. Seeing the Slayer smash the intercom to cut off Hayden lets us know that he is someone motivated by righteousness, sure, but we also understand that there is an underlying anger driving him as well, one that might have to do with deeper themes such as revenge or obsession, some darker element of his psyche that also motivates him. And this brief interaction also serves to outline the way in which these two characters are foils for one another. Where Hayden deceives, the Slayer acts. It is a classic case of an unstoppable force meeting an unbreakable wall. And it is truly brilliant how the game employs a very show-don't-tell approach to storytelling to do so much narrative work in setting up all of these in just a couple of very brief cutscenes. A small exchange, a few lines of dialogue, a couple of physical gestures. That is all that Doom 2016 uses to craft its narrative, and yet it is able to set up the story of the game, not to mention the personalities of its two central characters, in a clear yet subtle manner that is surprisingly nuanced and layered. If the opening level of Doom 2016 is great, it is not because it proves that you need to do away with story to have a good gameplay-oriented game, but because it shows the ways in which a game can craft a smart and compelling story without needing to be full of cutscenes and non-playable sequences. A story that is both deep and still able to center and support the gameplay above all else. Doom 2016 proves that you can have a game that feels like Doom while also being a good story game.
You've won. It's over. You stopped the invasion and closed the portal. But it's come at a price. Argent, Vega, this entire operation. You see, I've watched you work, come to understand your motivation. You think the only way is to kill them all, leave nothing behind. And you may be right. But we can't just shut it all down. Without Argent energy, it will be worse. I don't expect you to agree. But with this, we can continue our work. I am not the villain in this story. I do what I do because there is no choice.
Rerouting tether coordinates complete.
Our time is up. I can't kill you, but I won't have you standing in our way. Until we see each other again.
I first played Doom 2016 soon after its release, not because I was so excited about it that I was eagerly awaiting for it to come out, but because my brother, who is very into old school shooters, really loved the game, and he convinced me to give it a try. The expectations that I had going into the game were very simple. I expected the combat of the game to be really fun and very well crafted, since that's what everybody was talking about, and I expected the story of the game to be absolute garbage. In an ironic twist, however, it turned out that by the time that I was halfway through the game, honestly, the main thing that kept me playing was not the gameplay but the story. I wanted to hear more from Samuel Hayden. I wanted to see Hayden and the Slayer interact more. I wanted to see what would happen when they finally met. The main reason, really, that kept me motivated to play the game was just how great and how interesting of an antagonist Samuel Hayden is. There is a story sequence later in the game in which Hayden literally tries to bribe you, and by that I mean you, the player. After locking you inside a room, Hayden begins to explain the dire situation that he and the Slayer, the last two survivors at the UAC, find themselves in, which includes not only a demon invasion from hell, but also an imminent nuclear meltdown, and he casually gives you an Argent energy cell. These cells are normally found scattered throughout the game's levels, and they are used to upgrade your health, armor, or ammo. During this sequence, however, Hayden gives this one to you for free, no strings attached, because you'll need it to fight the demons, even as you try to prevent the aforementioned nuclear meltdown that would destroy the UAC entirely. The first time I saw this interaction, I just laughed because I thought, this is such a corrupt bureaucrat's move, to give me this no strings attached gift when you know there is absolutely an ulterior motive behind it. And because the Argent energy cell actually has a gameplay purpose to it, it felt like it wasn't just the Slayer who was being bribed, but myself as the player too. But what's truly brilliant about this little sequence is that the game doesn't make a big thing about it. Hayden just hands you the energy cell and the Slayer takes it. And yet, this simple gesture is charged with an underlying meaning. I just love how subtle this moment is, and in fact, it is this kind of subtlety that Doom 2016 excels at. I think Samuel Hayden is a great antagonist, but he is great because his characterization is as hands-off as anything else in Doom 2016's story. For one, you have the subtle symbolism of a soulless CEO who is literally inside a robot's body. Hayden has shed his humanity, quite literally, in his pursuit of Argent energy. And even more interesting than this subtle visual depiction is the fact that all Samuel Hayden does throughout the game is try to help you put an end to the horrible accident that created a rift between Mars and Hell. Hayden keeps constantly trying to put this savior's farce while trying to manipulate the Slayer all along. In fact, the way Hayden puts it, the real villain of the story is his subordinate Olivia Pierce, and all he really wants is to put an end to her wrongdoing, which really drives the point that Hayden is a cunning manipulator and that he will use anything to spin the narrative to his favor. Hayden's characterization shines because of all of these compelling yet subtle elements that are bubbling just under the surface of the game. But ultimately, the most important reason Hayden is a great antagonist is because he is such a good foil for the Slayer, which makes every single interaction between the two of them really compelling. For example, later in the game, during the Argent facility level, you need to shut off the production of Argent energy to progress in the game. Hayden asks the Slayer to be very careful when handling the Hell energy filters because Argent energy is very valuable, even if it is also the thing that caused the deaths of every living human in the UAC. Hayden constantly reiterates that the Slayer's task is only to disable the facility temporarily, and yet the Slayer, after giving it about 2 seconds of consideration, decides to simply stomp the filters instead, completely destroying them and shutting down the production of Argent energy for good in the process, much to the dismay of Hayden, who puts on the sulkiest voice ever to reproach the Slayer.
If stopping our energy production is what you want, then you need only to destroy this last filter, and Argent energy will no longer exist in this solar system. We will be back at square one. You have no idea what you have just done.
And it is these little moments, these little interactions, as brief and bare bones as they are, that which carries the story of Doom 2016 in a way that is compelling without being obtrusive. And the reason for this is that, once again, this kind of show-don't-tell approach to storytelling is able to do a lot of narrative work without doing a lot of narrative work.
They promised me so much.
One thing that Martin says in the Noclip documentary that I find fascinating is that after the development team continued to have trouble with the story because it was too serious, they decided to embrace instead a more humorous and self-aware tone for the game. You can see this tone clearly in the overall narrative of Doom 2016, as well as in small details littered throughout the game, such as the blue holograms that pop up occasionally as you play through a level, in which a UAC representative starts giving you some corporate spiel that is clearly a very self-aware and satirical take on work culture and capitalism. When talking about the game's self-aware tone, Martin mentions that you would expect a game dealing with demons and hell to be about occultism and secrecy, but Doom 2016 subverts these tropes by placing its narrative elements up front instead. Martin goes on to say that, quote, "How about as soon as you walk in it's playing on a megaphone? Like we need volunteers for the Revenant program. We're gonna turn people into demons." The demon invasion of Doom 2016 is not happening behind the curtains, as was the case in Doom 3. Quite the opposite actually, as the corporate overlords of the UAC, that is Samuel Hayden, know full well what they are dealing with. And not only are they not trying to shy away from it, but they have normalized it so that they can better profit from it. Martin goes on to give a few more examples when describing the tone that they were trying to go for in Doom 2016, saying that, quote, "There are board meetings about human sacrifices to summon the gods, or who's gonna donate their heart to the summoning of the next Baron. They have interns applying for this stuff, and there's posters in the lunchroom about Mancubus programs." In the Noclip documentary, the developers talk about how important this tone of self-awareness is for the story and the overall identity of Doom 2016. And yet, at times, I sense that same subtle yet dismissive stance that the developers sometimes take towards the story of Doom 2016 when they are talking about this too. However, I'd argue that Doom 2016's humorous and self-aware tone, far from being a simple little joke, is a brilliant way of setting up and developing the game's underlying themes for a very simple reason. That reason being that this is exactly how capitalism works in real life. Capitalism is insidious. It is ingrained into our identities from childhood, and so we grow up and work soul-crushing, dehumanizing jobs that barely allow us to survive paycheck to paycheck, and we learn to see this as a completely natural part of life. We are exploited and we are disposable. We have no real sense of job security. We have no access to decent healthcare. We live in a society with massive wealth inequality, and we see it as completely natural. If we get fired, we may struggle to find another job, and we are suddenly in danger of losing access to basic human rights such as housing or food. And it's our fault, because in capitalism, poverty is always the fault of the poor. In capitalism, you get exactly what you deserve. In capitalism, we are less than human. And that's without even taking into account the systemic injustices that capitalism itself is built upon, such as slavery, colonialism, racism, or sexism. And we live our lives every day as though this is natural. Why? Because capitalism is ingrained into our very worldviews. Not to mention the fact that work culture itself is very cult-like in nature too. We are taught from an early age to think of work as identity. Corporations still do things like referring to employees as family, for example. This is why merging the idea of cults and demons with work culture is a perfect fit, regardless of how cheesy or satirical the tone might be. In fact, the self-aware humor only adds depth to the parallel. So, yeah, having meetings in the UAC to decide who is going to be the next human sacrifice is ridiculous and absurd. But that is also precisely why this self-aware tone is such a genius lens to explore the theme of capitalism and work culture, because, from an outside perspective, capitalism must look as ridiculous and absurd as the UAC seems to us. I have the feeling that if you try to make the argument that Doom 2016's story tries to grapple with grand themes such as capitalism, maybe people would laugh in your face. After all, this is a Doom game. Even the game's developers seem to sell the game's story as an unimportant part of the whole experience, something to be ignored because Doom is just about fun and killing demons. In fact, one of the things that I find fascinating about the Noclip documentary is that it gives us a glimpse into the way in which the developers presented the story of Doom 2016 around the time of the game's release. And while sometimes they do discuss the ways in which the story of the game is sophisticated, as Martin himself puts it, they are also very dismissive of the role that the story has within the game as a whole, selling it as a kind of joke more than anything else. But the thing is that Doom 2016 does grapple with grand themes such as capitalism, labor exploitation, and evil corporations literally draining worlds dry for profit, even when that profit comes at the expense of the lives of normal people. And not only that, but I'd argue that Doom 2016 handles its overall narrative more deftly than your usual AAA game.
Now approaching UAC Advanced Research Complex.
It's time we meet in person. My office is on the second floor of this facility.
Welcome to the UAC, built on blood, sweat, and dreams.
So, how is it that Doom 2016's story works so well despite the fact that the game is not interested in a complicated storyline full of twists that requires long cutscenes filled with exposition and backstory and dialogue and a bunch of characters to be successful? Well, as I've been trying to argue, one part of it is the subtle show-don't-tell approach that the game takes towards its story. Another part has to do with how the game centers its story on the tension between its two central figures, as opposed to having a massive, expansive storyline. But here's another reason why Doom 2016's approach to storytelling is so smart. Doom 2016's overall narrative and themes work so well because they are concepts that we are already intimately familiar with by mere virtue of living in a capitalist world. The story of Doom 2016 doesn't require long, convoluted explanations because it's a story we all already know too well. Thus, neither the story's overarching themes nor many of its individual elements require a lot of narrative setup. And, incidentally, this is also why Doom 2016's more subtle and hands-off approach to storytelling is ultimately such a good fit. Take Samuel Hayden himself, a soulless CEO, or chairman as the game labels him, who has literally done away with his humanity, as he no longer even possesses a human body, and who is only interested in the bottom line. Hayden only cares about Argent energy. In fact, if the death of every person in the UAC is the price to pay for it, he'll gladly pay it. And yet, throughout the whole game, Hayden does nothing but quote-unquote help you. He wants nothing more than to make sure you understand that he is in fact the savior of humanity, even as he literally dries entire worlds and consumes hundreds of people to the bone. Does this sound familiar? How many soulless CEOs have we seen in real life trying to spin their web of BS while they literally dry the entire planet, as well as hundreds or thousands of workers to the bone? How many companies want us to believe that they are the saviors of humanity, while at the same time they do nothing but consume? I especially like how Hayden keeps trying to make the Slayer believe that all of the problems in the UAC facility were caused not by him, but by one of his subordinates, Olivia Pierce, a religious zealot who was lured by the demons with false promises. I have seen people mention that Pierce is the main antagonist of the game, and I can see why someone might want to make that argument. She is the final boss of the game after all. However, I think there's more to it than just that. Don't get me wrong, both Olivia Pierce and the demons themselves are villains within the context of the story. But there are also red herrings distracting you from the real antagonist sitting at the top of it all, Samuel Hayden. And this is not by accident, as Hayden himself is actively using Pierce and the demons to draw attention away from himself. Like I said, Hayden is such a great antagonist because he is cunning, and he will try to manipulate the narrative to his favor by any means necessary. But it is Hayden himself, as the CEO or chairman of the UAC, the one who is interested in Argent energy, knowing full well the dangers and costs that it carries. Hayden is the one who has taken the concept of hell energy and infused it into the very corporate culture of the UAC. And I think it is such a brilliant move to have Olivia Pierce thrown into the mix so that Hayden can have someone he can use as a smokescreen. I mean, how many times have we seen a CEO throw a lower worker or manager under the bus for the sake of keeping up appearances? Olivia Pierce is an interesting character because of how ambivalent her depiction is. She was seduced by demons and ultimately betrayed. But how is that different from the way Hayden treats the people who work at the UAC? I can almost understand why someone would make a pact with demons just to escape corporate life and the hellish work culture that we live in. But that's the point. As I mentioned before, I'm not trying to say that Olivia Pierce is blameless. What I am saying is that this is a narrative that we all know too well already, and as such, it is a narrative that doesn't require a convoluted plot to be functional. Quite the opposite, actually, as it literally only takes a brief conversation between Hayden and the Slayer for us to understand exactly how the character of Hayden is meant to work within the context of the game's story. We are able to intuitively understand that Hayden is full of it almost immediately, and we understand that he will try to use Olivia Pierce for his own advantage too. But more importantly, we are able to understand this easily enough without requiring a whole backstory or a convoluted narrative setup, because this is a story that we know too well already. Thus, the game is able to be subtle and sparse in terms of its storytelling without having to sacrifice a more nuanced and deep depiction of its story and characters. Or take those small details of self-aware humor that Hugo Martin mentions. Little things like the UAC holograms with their corporate spiel, or the signs that tell workers that there will be a human sacrifice after lunch or whatever. This one is also a narrative that we already know too well. How many jobs have you had where you get the clear sense that your employer would really prefer it if you sacrificed your own physical and emotional well-being for the sake of the company? How many jobs have you had that make it either explicitly or implicitly clear that you are expected to sacrifice yourself for the sake of producing? We are already intimately familiar with this story. You don't need a convoluted plot to drive the narrative's themes. Thus, Doom 2016 can imbue its gameplay elements with a deeper, more meaningful narrative symbolism in an organic and unobtrusive way. Similarly, you don't need to flesh out a whole convoluted backstory to explain what happened in the UAC prior to the Slayer's awakening. This is also a story we all know too well already, the story of capitalism. You don't need to tell us about the labor exploitation or the role that Samuel Hayden as CEO played in the whole thing. You don't need to explain the story of how a company is messing with things it shouldn't mess with out of greed. You don't need to explain the lack of safety, the cutting of corners, the unsafe working conditions, because we know about them already. You don't need to explain to us how the mess of capitalism eventually leads to disaster, in this case a literal invasion of demons from hell. The player already knows this story intimately enough simply by living in a capitalist society, not to mention that this is also an already well-established trope within the genre of sci-fi in general. There are a million stories out there already about greedy corporations messing with forces they shouldn't be messing with until, big surprise, all hell breaks loose. Usually, the word trope seems to carry with itself a negative connotation within the context of media analysis and the topic of storytelling in general. But tropes are a tool that you can use to your advantage too, and Doom 2016 excels at doing so. By tapping into these well-established tropes and narratives, the game can set up an overall story that we can intuitively latch onto and understand at a very nuanced level without having to do a lot of narrative work to flesh it out. This is why the subtle approach that Doom 2016 takes towards its story works so well, as it allows for the player to organically project their own experiences and knowledge to fill in the gaps of the story by themselves, something that is especially important for a game like Doom since it was built under the philosophy of putting gameplay first. So, to summarize, the story of Doom 2016 doesn't need a convoluted setup because it is a story we all know already. It's the hell of capitalism, of bureaucracy, of corporations gaslighting employees into giving up their lives for the company. We understand the core of this story because we've seen this narrative play out in real life and in countless other fictional works over and over already. And that's why the story of Doom, as subtle and sparse as it is, can stand so well on its own as a cohesive narrative work without the need of complicated plot threads and long expository cutscenes, which in turn allows for the game to center the story on the things that really matter. In the case of Doom 2016, this means that you can place an emphasis on the conflict between the Slayer and Hayden itself to drive the story. In a general sense, this subtle show-don't-tell approach to crafting a story fits the medium of games really well because it allows for nuanced storytelling that doesn't require a lot of narrative work to pull off. But this narrative style is especially crucial for a game like Doom 2016, whose whole vision was built on the idea of centering gameplay above all else. And yet, as Doom 2016 itself proves, centering gameplay doesn't necessarily mean doing away with story. It means finding smarter ways to go about crafting a story, ways that fit the particular medium which you're working with. Now, the only significant problem that I have with the story of Doom 2016 is that it is never resolved in a meaningful way, mainly because the game ends with a cliffhanger meant to set up a sequel, which we would eventually get in the form of Doom Eternal. But Doom Eternal, as I'll discuss later, fails to bring the story to a satisfying conclusion in the end, thus leaving Doom 2016 in a kind of narrative void. And while you can absolutely have a story that is both the first part of a larger work while also being able to stand on its own, I don't think that Doom 2016 quite manages to accomplish this either. In the Noclip documentary, Hugo Martin says that the development team kept pushing the story of Doom 2016 back to deal with at a later time while working on the game. If this is true, then I think that they might have just decided to go ahead and keep pushing the story all the way to the next game, figuring that they could just resolve the story later with Doom Eternal. There is not much point in discussing what could have been. But I would have really loved to see Doom 2016 explore the conflict that exists between the two central figures of the game to a deeper and more complex degree. See, the reason Hayden is such a great antagonist is because he is a great foil for the Slayer. In a way, Hayden and the Slayer are opposites of one another. Hayden is a lying, manipulative bureaucrat while the Slayer is a person of action who is driven by emotion. But even more interesting than this is the fact that, in a different way, these two characters are also very similar. They are both single-mindedly obsessed with something. Hayden only cares about Argent energy despite the cost that it takes to get it, and the Slayer only cares about killing demons despite the cost that it takes to do so. While I think that the Slayer is an interesting character in how he is the opposite of Samuel Hayden, the Slayer's obsession, as well as his single-minded ideology of just shoot everything dead, can be just as dangerous in its own way as that of Hayden's. And one problem that Doom 2016 has is that it fails to capitalize on this tension, choosing instead to constantly romanticize its depiction of the Slayer a bit too much. I would have loved to see a story that attempts to complicate the character of the Slayer in a deeper and more interesting way, and, in fact, the reason I'm bringing this up is because Doom 2016 almost does this, but it pulls back at the last moment. In a level late in the game, Hayden tells the Slayer that he must go back to Hell one last time to find and stop Olivia Pierce for good. However, the only way of opening another portal to Hell requires the Slayer to essentially kill Vega, the AI that has accompanied him throughout the whole game. And yet, upon hearing this, the Slayer immediately gets to the task of killing Vega with no hesitation at all. If that's what it takes to stop the demons, killing Vega is a price that the Slayer is willing to pay without even stopping to think about it for a second. Now, Vega is an AI, but the game makes it clear that he has a consciousness. In fact, throughout this whole level, Vega keeps making comments that very clearly imply that he does not want to die. And yet, the Slayer keeps marching relentlessly on, never considering that killing someone might actually be going too far in his obsession of destroying all demons. After the last and very intense combat encounter of this level, the Slayer gets into an elevator that slowly crawls up to the room where Vega's consciousness is kept. Then, after the elevator, the Slayer continues through a deserted hallway, and he is forced to wait while two massive doors slowly open, finally revealing Vega's core. This is a fascinating sequence because it is so unlike anything else that you have seen in the game. This elevator ride with nothing happening in it stands out so much in a game where you are always zooming around at breakneck speeds while shooting demons. And yet, here, you can do nothing but stand and wait. You wait as the elevator climbs slowly upward. You wait as you walk along the deserted hallway. And you wait as the two massive doors slowly open. When people think about Doom 2016, they think about this. Or they think about this. Or maybe they think about this. But how often do they think about this? This very simple sequence has such an ominous feel to it, from the mesmerizing lights glinting around you to the unnerving music playing in the background. Unnerving because it's so different from every other hard rocking song you've heard in the game prior to this. This is a sequence that feels like it was taken straight out of an indie sci-fi movie or something like that, not a Doom game. And all along, you're just standing there, waiting. You can almost feel the Slayer having to sit there with his thoughts, being forced to reckon with the fact that he may be going too far in his single-minded obsession. Then, when you finally make it to the top and through the doors, Vega's processing unit looms ominously before you as you wonder if the Slayer will go through with it, if he'll really kill Vega so heartlessly. But, of course he does. He does so because he must do it. He does so because he can't bring himself to stop, just as Samuel Hayden cannot bring himself to put an end to his pursuit of Argent energy. This is a scene that is truly charged with an emotional tension that you wouldn't expect from a game like Doom 2016, and it is brilliant. Well, at least up to the point when it turns out that the Slayer can just press a button to download Vega's consciousness into his suit, so nothing really happens. Vega's life is spared at the last second. Instead of dying, he is just transferred into the Slayer's helmet. The game is not willing to complicate its depiction of the Slayer in the end, and it's unfortunate because Doom 2016 has proven up to this point that it can handle its story in a very smart and surprisingly nuanced way. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, Hugo Martin did a director's playthrough of Doom Eternal in which he streamed himself playing through the whole game while talking about it, and it was a really fun and interesting experience. During this playthrough, however, there was one episode where he and community manager Joshua Boyle played through a single level of Doom 2016, which was chosen by the viewers. Martin and Boyle gave the chat a number of levels to choose from, and people voted for the one they wanted to see. And which one was the level that won the vote? It was a level called Vega Central Processing, also known as Vega Core, the same level that I just discussed, which prompted both Martin and Boyle to say that they were surprised chat would pick Vega Core over the other levels. And to be fair, I was surprised too, but clearly there's something to this level that has captivated people in the same way that it has captivated me. The playthrough of the level itself, however, was fascinating to me because Martin says a lot of really interesting things pertaining to the topics I've discussed in this video. There are some general comments about the design of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. Martin says, for example, that in retrospective, he realized that there was a lot of Doom 3 in Doom 2016. He mentions that there is a lot of atmosphere driving Doom 2016, whereas Doom Eternal favors gameplay in every possible way. But by far, the most interesting part of this discussion happens at the end of the level, when they get to the tense elevator ride that I just analyzed. When Vega's processing unit comes into view, Boyle makes the comment that he didn't expect to see some, quote, sci-fi badass Akira-looking thing in Doom ever, and they discuss how the whole sequence is built on rising tension and anticipation, which is exactly what I was trying to get at. The tension of this sequence hinges on the anticipation of seeing if the Slayer will go through with killing Vega or not. After all, Vega has been our comfort throughout the whole game, as Boyle himself puts it. But then, Boyle makes a comment that I find both funny and fascinating. When they finally get to the part where the Slayer saves Vega by downloading it into his own suit, Boyle says, quote, "I'm sure the lore people are like, but what if he didn't back it up, Hugo? What then? What's the game then?" To which Martin replies that if the Slayer had indeed decided to kill Vega, then he, quote, would have made a pretty dramatic decision. Now, I don't really consider myself a lore person, but I am fascinated by the narrative style of Doom 2016, and I find Martin's response interesting to consider just in general. I mean, I agree with him. If the Slayer had gone through with killing Vega in order to feed his single-minded obsession, then that would have been a very dramatic decision. Dramatic in the best possible literary meaning of the word. But, like I said at the beginning of this section, there is no point in wondering about what could have been. As for the ending of the game in general, I'm ultimately not sure if Doom 2016 does enough to successfully bring the story of the game into a resolution that is able to stand on its own. It's a shame that the game is not willing to depict the Slayer in a more morally ambiguous manner, which I think would have been really cool, but at least we do see some consequences for the Slayer's actions. I like that, in the end, Samuel Hayden is the one who comes on top. Hayden, as cunning as always, is able to manipulate the Slayer in a way that allows him to deal with both the Slayer and Olivia Pierce in one swift blow. After the Slayer finishes off Pierce, he is left stranded in hell by Hayden. So, while the game doesn't allow for the Slayer to go through with killing Vega, at least we do see a consequence for the Slayer's obsession with destroying all demons, one that Hayden ultimately takes advantage of. But is this enough to give Doom 2016 a sense of achieving a proper and meaningful resolution? I go back and forth on this question, but I think that ultimately the answer is no, at least for me. I don't think Doom 2016's ending is enough to make the game be able to stand on its own as a cohesive narrative work. In the end, the story of Doom 2016 feels like it's left underdeveloped or incomplete. And so, as far as this game goes in general, and despite having what I perceive to be a flawed ending, I have tried to make the argument that Doom 2016's story is brilliantly crafted in a way that proves that you can, in fact, have a story-driven AAA experience without having to fall into the usual narrative traps that you tend to see in many AAA games. Doom 2016 shows us that if you lean into the unique strengths that the medium of games offers, you can craft unique and nuanced stories that don't require involved and convoluted narrative setups full of traditional storytelling elements such as exposition-filled cutscenes. This is probably why, despite the fact that I thought Doom 2016 ultimately failed to bring its story to a meaningful resolution, I must have been one of the few people on planet Earth who was really looking forward to playing its sequel, Doom Eternal, not because of its gameplay, but because I wanted to know where the developers would take the story. And then, I played Doom Eternal. If we're talking strictly about gameplay, Doom Eternal is as close to being perfect as a game can ever hope to be. Eternal revises and polishes 2016's gameplay and turns it into one of the most mesmerizing and satisfying gameplay loops that I've ever experienced. Doom Eternal's gameplay is truly a masterpiece, and there are already a million video analyses out there taking a deep dive into why this is the case. However, even as Doom Eternal expands on and nearly perfects the push-forward combat first established by its predecessor, Eternal also loses everything that made the story of Doom 2016 so great, falling back into exactly the type of conventional and uninspired storytelling that Doom 2016 so intelligently managed to avoid. Now, I want to say something before moving on with the video. I believe that the story of Doom Eternal is really bad in almost every single aspect, and I feel really guilty about saying this because I know that a lot of people put a lot of work and passion into this game. I also, in a general sense, don't like to make negative analyses where the bulk of my argument is just that this thing is bad. I don't think there is a lot of value in these types of analyses. That being said, I do want to dive a little bit into why I think that Doom Eternal fails where Doom 2016 succeeds, as it is relevant to the scope of this video. And so, while I won't be spending a lot of time discussing Doom Eternal's story, I do want to briefly break down some of the story elements of Doom Eternal, as well as its overall narrative structure and style, in order to discuss the ways in which Doom Eternal fails when compared to its predecessor. To start off, the thing that most surprised me about Doom Eternal when it comes to its story was its decision to do away with one of the most interesting aspects of Doom 2016, its main antagonist. Samuel Hayden is not the main antagonist anymore, and in fact, he is completely absent from about half of the game, despite the fact that he would have been a great antagonist in Eternal. Even more strange than that is that when Hayden does show up again, he is not even really a villain anymore, taking up instead a kind of sidekick or companion role that is very similar to the role that Vega played in Doom 2016. Basically, Doom Eternal's story starts us off as the Slayer makes his way back from Hell, only to find that a demonic invasion has almost decimated the entirety of planet Earth. We also eventually learn that during the course of this invasion, an invasion that might have or might have not been caused by him in the first place, Samuel Hayden bravely became the leader of the human resistance, ultimately falling in battle heroically for the sake of humanity. The first time I learned about this little twist, I loved it because I thought that it was such a Samuel Hayden move. I mean, what an ironic turn. Hayden literally becoming humanity's savior, right? And of course, I didn't buy it even for a second. In fact, my immediate thought to this was classic Samuel Hayden, still trying to manipulate the narrative and paint himself as the hero, despite the fact that he'd sacrificed the whole planet himself for some Argent energy if he could. Not to mention that, as I just said, when we first begin the game, we don't know anything about its story, and so for all we know, the demon invasion might have been Hayden's fault to begin with. This is all to say that I think that there would have been a lot of potential within Doom Eternal's story to keep expanding upon Samuel Hayden's character in interesting ways. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to say that Samuel Hayden needed to remain in Doom Eternal unchanged, playing the same role that he did in Doom 2016. In fact, I appreciate that the developers decided to go in a new direction. However, I find this decision of doing away with Hayden as the main antagonist to be a bit mind-boggling for two reasons. The first reason is simply that why fix what isn't broken? There was still a lot to explore with Hayden at the end of Doom 2016. And the second, perhaps more important reason is that Doom Eternal chooses to replace Hayden with no antagonist at all. And okay, that's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of not a joke. Doom Eternal has some minor villains in the form of the three priests that you must hunt down throughout the game, but these are some of the most uninteresting villains I've ever seen in a game. It doesn't feel like there is anything at stake with them, narratively speaking, so much so that at first I thought that the three priests were only gonna be used as a kind of throwaway subplot in order to set up the proper story of the game, only to find that, in reality, the three priests are the story of the game. And then there is also the Khan Maker, the game's actual main antagonist, who is such a blank void of a character that I completely forget she even exists most of the time. And then you have the DLCs, titled The Ancient Gods Part 1 and 2, which are packed full of hollow plot twists as the game desperately tries to find some way to resolve the story. It turns out, for example, that Samuel Hayden is actually an alien referred to as the Seraphim, who also happens to be a messenger and servant of literally God. And then it turns out that Vega is literally God. And then there is this fortress that you can go to, and if you pass a series of tests, then you get the soul of God and the devil as a reward or something. I guess someone was just keeping the soul of God there for reasons, and Samuel Hayden wants the soul of God also for reasons, and then the devil turns out to be a doppelganger of the Doomslayer because reasons, and well, let's just say that the story of Doom Eternal, more so than that of Doom 2016, lives up to Hugo Martin's words in that it feels like it was cobbled together hastily at the end of development. And while I'd want to say that the pandemic might have had something to do with the overall quality of the story in the DLCs, the reality is that if you look at the base game of Doom Eternal, you can see that the state of the story was already not in a good place even then. Honestly, by the time I got to the end of the first DLC, the quality of the story had dropped so much that I wasn't even paying attention anymore. In an ironic twist, my experience with Doom Eternal was exactly the opposite of my experience with Doom 2016. I first decided to play Doom Eternal because of the story, but halfway through the game, it was the gameplay instead which kept me motivated to continue playing the game. Now, the next big criticism that I have about Doom Eternal's narrative style is that the game does the bulk of its storytelling through its so-called codex entries, which can be accessed from the main menu whenever you pause the game. That is to say that, to even understand the cutscenes that are in the game, you have to go into a menu to read long text entries that explain the story to you, which is just not an interesting way to do a video game story at all. And to be clear, Doom 2016 also has codex entries, but they're there just to expand on the game's lore and world building, or at the very least, the story of Doom 2016 is so well written that it can stand on its own without the codex entries being an essential part of it. In Doom Eternal, however, the codex entries are the story. Like I said, the game's cutscenes don't even make sense if you don't read the supplemental codex entries, which only compounds to the already decaying state of the story. I get the sense that the developers might have been so concerned about keeping the story away from the game that they decided to just bury it in a menu, which is a strange choice when you consider the fact that there is nothing more intrusive to gameplay than having to pause the game to go read a wall of text. Hugo Martin actually talked briefly about this when he was invited back to do an interview for the Noclip podcast in order to promote the upcoming release of Eternal. During the interview, Martin states that the approach they took when crafting the story of Eternal was the same approach they used when they were working on Doom 2016, going on to say that, just as was the case with Doom 2016, the story of Eternal is very hands-off, and it's up to the player to engage with it by going into the menu and reading the codex entries if they so desire. In other words, if the player is interested in the story of Eternal, they can go ahead and read those codex entries, and if they're not, then they can simply ignore the story altogether. But I strongly disagree with these statements. I don't think that Eternal's approach to storytelling is the same as that of Doom 2016 at all, not even close. Before I get into that, however, I have a confession to make. I have never read any of the codex entries of either Doom Eternal or Doom 2016. Using lore entries found in menus to tell a story in a video game might actually be the thing I hate the most when it comes to video game storytelling. It's worse than having endless non-interactive cutscenes interrupting gameplay constantly, for me at least. As such, I never read any of these types of lore entries whenever I play a game, unless there is a good enough reason within the context of a game's narrative that compels me to do so. And I have played games that convince me that reading story entries in a menu can be an essential and engaging part of the game's overall narrative structure. Now, while Doom 2016 has a menu full of codex entries that expand on the game's overall lore and world building, I'd argue that Doom 2016's story is able to stand on its own without requiring the player to read any of these codex entries at all. That's precisely what I've been trying to argue in this video, as I've explored the ways in which Doom 2016's show-don't-tell approach to storytelling so brilliantly manages to craft a subtle yet nuanced story that doesn't get in the way of the gameplay. And I am completely aware that, by choosing to ignore the codex entries of Doom 2016, my interpretation of the story might be flawed, or it might differ from the lore that can be found within the codex entries themselves. But if that's the case, then I'd argue that my interpretation of the story might just be better because I truly believe that the story of Doom 2016 is brilliantly crafted as is. For example, I made the argument earlier that the true main antagonist of the story of Doom 2016 is Samuel Hayden, not Olivia Pierce, but maybe if I were to read the codex entries, I would find out that Pierce is in fact the real villain. Maybe she used her religious zealots to undermine Hayden's power and take control of the UAC, and Hayden really is relatively innocent. Maybe I misinterpreted some of the elements of the story or missed some important details, but I'm okay with that because I understand that having a sense of ambiguity is one of the qualities that comes with this style of subtle storytelling, and it's a good quality to have, as ambiguity can add a richness to the overall story, especially when said story is so sparse to begin with. The ambiguity present in Doom 2016 makes the relationship between Hayden and Pierce all the more compelling, as well as the way in which they are connected to the events that led up to the destruction of the UAC. At the very least, I find this style of storytelling much more interesting than having to read a bunch of exposition field entries in a menu. However, the only reason this ambiguity is able to work within the context of Doom 2016 is because the sparse story elements that are present in the game are smart enough and well written enough that they can stand on their own as a cohesive story without the need of the codex entries. Doom Eternal, on the other hand, does away with Doom 2016's intelligent approach to storytelling and instead asks the player to go read a bunch of menu entries to even be able to understand the story. Doom 2016's brief cutscenes are able to do a lot of narrative work without doing a lot of narrative work, as my analysis of the game's iconic opening level has hopefully demonstrated. The cutscenes in Doom Eternal, however, are impossible to even understand without having read the relevant codex entries first. This is why I disagree with the statement that Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal share the same approach to storytelling. I think that Doom Eternal misunderstands the subtle style of storytelling that drives the story of Doom 2016. In Doom 2016, the story is subtle and very hands-off because it is approached from a careful and concise style of writing where every little detail that we get is charged with meaning and does a lot of narrative work. This is why the cutscenes in Doom 2016 are capable of standing on their own despite of how brief and simple they are. Doom Eternal, however, seems to think that a subtle/hands-off style of storytelling means that you just hide the story away in a menu, and if people are interested in the story, then they can go ahead and pause the game to go read a wall of text. In other words, whereas every little detail in Doom 2016 is doing a lot of work, narratively speaking, the story elements present in Doom Eternal are nothing but shallow ornaments meant to make the game look cool. Now, moving on, another creative decision that strikes me as odd is that Doom Eternal does away with that great sense of self-awareness that worked so well in Doom 2016 and which I loved so much because it provided a surprisingly interesting exploration of themes like corporations and capitalism. To be clear, the over-the-top and cheesy tone of Doom 2016 is still present in Eternal. For example, the funny blue holograms with their satirical corporate spiel are still there, but they ring hollow this time around. In fact, they feel weirdly out of place because the corporate context that gave them meaning in Doom 2016 is completely absent from Eternal. This is because, in Doom Eternal, the theme of capitalism is gone alongside with Samuel Hayden. Instead, the game leans heavily into a more mythological/biblical aesthetic to give us an extremely generic story about how angels, which in this case are actually aliens, turn out to be just as evil as demons. There's even a whole trip to hell in Doom Eternal that's weirdly based on Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, which doesn't even make sense. I mean, why would these aliens create a whole Dante's Inferno theme park to extract Argent energy out of human souls? If anything, I would have loved to see these levels, which depict the process of draining human souls, having a more industrial or factory-like aesthetic to them. These would at least continue to expand on the theme of capitalism from Doom 2016. Instead, what we get with Doom Eternal is a game that tries to take itself very seriously at times, but which fails in every way to create a compelling enough story. Thinking about this actually takes me back to Hugo Martin's words from the Noclip documentary when he's talking about how you would expect a story dealing with demons and hell to be about occultism and secrecy, and how Doom 2016 so smartly subverts this by putting it up front and making it about a corporation instead, brilliantly blending the biblical with the corporate. In this way, Doom 2016 does away with common cliches and crafts a smart story that is surprisingly deep and nuanced. Doom Eternal, on the other hand, is content with employing a basic and cliché biblical vibe for the game that is about as shallow as you'd expect it to be. And nowhere is this more obvious than during those super generic Dante's Inferno style levels that take place near the end of the game. In other words, while Doom 2016 employs smart writing to avoid clichés and shallow storytelling, Doom Eternal is nothing but cliché and shallow storytelling. It is true that, as Martin himself puts it, Doom 2016 draws heavily from Doom 3 while Doom Eternal takes inspiration from the original Doom games instead. The third and final episode of the original release of Doom 1, for example, is titled Inferno, and it has references to Dante's Divine Comedy. It's obvious that the people working at id Software at the time clearly loved that over-the-top biblical vibe, and it works really well for that game. As such, I understand that Doom Eternal's cheesy style is consistent with that of the original Doom game that started it all. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, and I'm certainly not trying to say that you can't have a good story crafted around this kind of cheesy, over-the-top tone. But just because Doom Eternal borrows heavily from the aesthetic of Doom 1, it doesn't mean that it's limited by it. Doom Eternal can borrow the style of Doom 1 and do something more interesting with it. Taking on the legacy of the original Doom games doesn't mean that you must have a bad story just because the original Doom games didn't care about story at all in the first place. Doom Eternal might be the successor of Doom 1 and 2 in spirit, but it is also a literal sequel to Doom 2016, and there's no good reason why Eternal couldn't be both of these things at the same time. In fact, before Doom Eternal was even conceived, Doom 2016 had already succeeded in merging the seriousness of Doom 3 with a more self-aware layer of cheese, as Martin himself puts it. And even more importantly, Doom 2016 had already proven that you can have a well-written story that is also self-aware and cheesy, and, perhaps more importantly, a story that can be complex yet hands-off so as to not get in the way of the gameplay. But in its single-minded obsession of prioritizing gameplay above all else, Doom Eternal fails to learn any lessons from the brilliant writing style of its predecessor. Instead, Doom Eternal is content with having a mediocre story where aesthetic replaces substance. That being said, I do want to end this section by bringing up something that I think is really important when considering Doom Eternal under this context, which is that I think you could very easily make the argument that none of the things that I just discussed matter at all in the end, because Doom Eternal was never interested in telling a good story in the first place. As the developers of the game have said over and over themselves, Doom Eternal's main goal was to emphasize a masterfully polished gameplay loop above all else, and so it makes sense that Doom Eternal would simply not care about the narrative style of Doom 2016. Storytelling was just not something that was important within the development process of Doom Eternal. The game was never designed with narrative elements in mind. Story in Eternal is only a practical framework for the gameplay, and I think that this is an absolutely valid way to approach game design. Video essayist Arnok has a great video diving into the design of both Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal that I find really interesting in this regard. In it, she makes the argument that, through its carefully crafted design, Doom Eternal creates an emotionally driven narrative rather than a plot-based story. And I totally agree with this statement. Games in general excel at using game mechanics to create emergent narrative arcs or storylines that are built not from traditional storytelling techniques, but from the various gameplay elements of a game itself and the way in which they interact with one another. This is one of the reasons why I find games so fascinating. And this is why I don't mind when a game uses story elements for the purely practical purpose of creating a premise so that the gameplay can take place, and Doom Eternal succeeds in doing this. Despite the fact that the story of Doom Eternal is not good, you can still argue that the developers of Eternal accomplished everything they set out to do. And yet the reason I keep coming back to Doom 2016 when thinking about this is because I believe that Doom 2016 proved that there are smarter ways in which games can approach the process of storytelling in a way that allows for them to center gameplay while also being able to craft subtle yet nuanced stories. Doom 2016, much like Doom Eternal, creates an emotionally driven narrative through its gameplay. Gameplay is at the core of Doom 2016's identity. And yet, what strikes me so much about this game is the way in which its brilliant gameplay design is paired alongside a smart approach to storytelling in order to create an experience that goes beyond your usual gameplay-centered game, which in turn gives us a glimpse of the untapped potential that still remains within the medium of games as works of storytelling. In the end, if I consider Doom Eternal on its own terms, then I don't really care that the game's story is such a mess, as telling a story in the traditional sense is not really what the game sets out to do. However, if I consider Doom Eternal as the direct sequel of Doom 2016, that's when I get a bit frustrated because I get the sense that Eternal fails to continue to build upon its predecessor's brilliant writing style, and that's a shame because despite the fact that Doom Eternal is a near-perfect game if we look at it purely through the lens of gameplay design, I am ultimately left with the impression that Doom Eternal could have been so much more.
Kill the intruder.
Over the last few years, there has been a growing interest in a subgenre of first-person shooters referred to as boomer shooters, games that try to go against modern gaming trends by drawing inspiration from the golden era of first-person shooters of the 90s instead. Now, the rise of the boomer shooter is actually a surprisingly interesting and complex topic, but it is also one that is beyond the scope of the arguments I'm making here. As such, I'll be oversimplifying my discussion of it for the purpose of this video. One thing I've noticed is that if you go online and you start looking up information about boomer shooters, you'll start to see the same words and ideas being thrown around over and over when discussing the question of what exactly makes up a boomer shooter. Boomer shooters have fast movement and fast combat. They tend to center gameplay over story, and they shy away from the more cinematic style of storytelling that is present in single-player AAA shooters. They have a 90s vibe or otherwise call back to the design aesthetic of classic shooters. They have a retro feel to them, sometimes visible in their graphics, sometimes present in their design philosophy and gameplay mechanics, which, once again, harken back to the design choices of classic shooters, such as having no regenerating life and no reloading, featuring non-linear levels built with exploration in mind, and having a higher level of difficulty or challenge overall. Thus, an important quality commonly assigned to boomer shooters seems to be that they came about in response to the changing trends in the gaming industry over the last couple of decades, which, in the eyes of some gamers, has grown more and more detached from the values embodied by classic shooters and other games of that time. With the rise of the modern indie gaming landscape, however, there has also been an increase in small studios with the ability to create more niche and countercultural gaming experiences. Boomer shooters, then, being one such subgenre, are meant to appeal to an audience of gamers disenchanted by the trends found in AAA gaming, such as live service games and the Battle Royale frenzy, or, even before that, the way in which AAA games became too casual and hand-holdy, with single-player games choosing to disregard gameplay in favor of placing an emphasis on creating linear and more narrative-oriented experiences. This is what the narrative surrounding boomer shooters seems to be. In an article written for Game Informer titled "Inside the Rise of Boomer Shooters," Pau Jumol traces the basic history that led to the current trend of boomer shooters in a way that I found interesting. Jumol writes that the original Doom, along with Wolfenstein, were at the center of the rise of the modern first-person shooter genre itself, and that, together, these two games kick-started a PC gaming revolution. He goes on to say that, quote, "For a moment in the 90s, it felt like Doom clutched the very future in its claw, but over the next 2 decades, the FPS genre reinvented itself many times over to accommodate the trends of the gaming industry. Games became more cutscene heavy and hand-holdy, more linear and cinematic. There was a trend within the AAA gaming industry to create quote-unquote prestige games that would be on par with films in terms of artistry, a trend fueled by games like The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite. The age of the Doom clone, as Jumal puts it, was over, at least until boomer shooters like Dusk, Amid Evil, and Ultrakill called back to the golden era of first-person shooters and revived interest in the design aesthetics of classic shooters, which had been long lost during the many changes that gripped the gaming industry in the decades since. Like I said, this is the narrative that seems to be behind the rising interest in the boomer shooter subgenre. At the very least, this seems to be the narrative as it is perceived by boomer shooter fans themselves. And, like I said, I've never been interested in first-person shooters, so this is a part of gaming history that I don't have a personal connection to, which ultimately doesn't really matter because the reason that I find all of this so interesting, and the reason that I'm bringing it up now, is that interestingly enough, the language used when discussing the topic of boomer shooters is exactly the same language used by the developers of Doom 2016 in the Noclip documentary when they're talking about the design philosophy that drove the game's development. The cancelled Doom 4 project was described as having a lot more in common with the trends of the AAA gaming industry at the time. It was cinematic, linear, cutscene heavy, etc. Doom 2016, on the other hand, rose as a reaction to both Doom 4 and those larger trends that dominated the gaming landscape. Much like boomer shooters, Doom 2016 harkened back to the design of the original Doom games and the golden era of first-person shooters that they represent. Boomer shooters are an obvious callback to the gaming conventions as well as the visual aesthetic of older first-person shooters, such as the original Doom and Quake games. But I get the feeling that both Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal have been just as instrumental in bringing about this newfound interest in classic shooters precisely because of the ways in which these two games take inspiration from and innovate upon the formula of the original Doom games. In fact, I remember that when Doom 2016 released, it received high praises precisely because it was a refreshing callback to the classic first-person shooters of old, and even now, people who talk about Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal do so through this same lens, praising these games for boldly doing away with AAA trends and elevating gameplay above all else. However, to me, the genius of Doom 2016 lies in the fact that it didn't just bring back the old design conventions of its predecessors, it used them as inspiration to innovate and modernize the classic shooter to fit a modern gaming audience. And whether it was intentional or not, I'd argue that Doom 2016 is just as innovative when it comes to its storytelling style. The story of the original Doom games was literally a joke because the one thing that really mattered was the gameplay. Video games were perceived and conceived as toys more than pieces of creative art, and at the time, with games being such a young medium, there wasn't a cultural body of work and experience that developers could draw from. There wasn't a narrative language that games could borrow, certainly not one that would fit the inherent limitations of the medium. But again, the genius of Doom 2016 lies in the fact that it manages to emphasize gameplay while also taking a more intelligent approach to storytelling that is a better fit for modern audiences craving compelling and well-written stories in their games. In other words, Doom 2016 doesn't just innovate upon the gameplay conventions of older shooters, it also modernizes their storytelling conventions, and more importantly, it manages to accomplish this without neglecting or sacrificing the design of its gameplay.
at your will, their sword. You remain unbroken. For your might is eternal.
The other day I was watching a trailer for an upcoming first-person shooter that fits the definition of a boomer shooter. And within the comments section of the video I found a couple of comments that struck me as interesting. One user said that, quote, Doom-style games are its own art style and I love every single one of them, to which another user responded by saying, they've become especially more valuable in the modern age where most games are clunky, low frame rate, cutscene/dialogue driven nonsense. This is the very idea embodied both by boomer shooters and by the design philosophy behind Doom 2016, a rejection of the trends that have engulfed and dominated the AAA gaming industry over the past decades in favor of a return to the golden era of shooters where gameplay was the only thing that mattered. And, to be fair, there is plenty to hate about the current AAA gaming industry. As Doom 2016 itself shows us, capitalism is awful and soulless and so adept at sucking the creative spirit out of art and artists, not to mention their livelihoods. I have made arguments against the AAA gaming landscape before. Just in my previous video, I talk about the fact that I've been disenchanted for a while now by the way in which the AAA gaming industry approaches narrative-driven games. However, I don't have a problem with narrative-driven games per se. I have a problem with the fact that the AAA gaming industry seems to believe that the only way to go about creating a narrative-driven game is by employing traditional storytelling elements that fail to capitalize on the potential that the medium of video games offers. I don't have a problem with story games, I just think that there is a smarter way to go about crafting stories in games in the first place. As I already mentioned, in the Noclip documentary, Hugo Martin says that he loves story games, but that this approach wasn't right for Doom. My issue with this statement is that it still subscribes to this wrong notion that you can either pack your game full of cutscenes or you cannot have a story game. And yet, ironically, the very reason that I love Doom 2016's story so much is because it proves that there are smarter ways to approach the art of crafting a video game story in a manner that is nuanced and compelling while also being unobtrusive to the gameplay itself. In the end, I understand that developers must make decisions and form priorities during the development process. Kevin Cloud, who was in charge of the Snapmap feature of Doom 2016, puts it in a very interesting way. He mentions that games are built in layers and that you can't experience a game as a user until the very end. I found this comment to be fascinating because I cannot imagine what the process of trying to put together a story within a context like this one would be like. Ultimately, I think it's fine if the developers of Doom Eternal made the conscious choice to focus on polishing the game's incredible gameplay loop at the cost of neglecting the story, if that's what happened. Diverting resources away from crafting the core gameplay loop wouldn't have made sense within the context of what the game was trying to accomplish. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that Doom Eternal, far from learning from the choices of its predecessor, which brilliantly succeeded at incorporating a nuanced story in a simple yet compelling way, decided instead to completely ignore those lessons and simply craft yet another mindless video game experience, at least when it comes to the topic of its storytelling. In terms of gameplay, Eternal revises and builds upon what was established in Doom 2016. But in terms of storytelling, Eternal fails to do the same, opting instead to go for the very kind of storytelling that Doom 2016 so smartly managed to subvert. It's okay to have games that just want to focus on gameplay and where the story simply performs a purely practical job. But after playing through Doom 2016, I just expected more out of Doom Eternal. In other words, the reason I had such high expectations of the game to begin with was precisely because of how brilliantly the story of Doom 2016 was crafted in the first place. The vision driving the design of Doom 2016 was originally fueled by a desire to go against the trends that dominated the AAA industry. But Doom 2016 was more than just a game that simply decided to do away with story altogether for the sake of centering its gameplay, which is what Doom Eternal does through the choice of burying its story within its codex entries. In fact, if there is a lesson to be learned from Doom 2016 is that there are smarter ways to go about crafting a narrative-driven game, especially when that game is as gameplay-focused as Doom 2016 is. Having a narrative-driven game doesn't need to translate into an endless struggle to balance story and gameplay to the point that you must sacrifice one in order for the other to survive. The developers of Doom 2016 might have really believed that the story of their game was nothing but a hindrance during the development process, or maybe they simply opted to promote the game in those terms so as to appeal to gamers who were tired of the trends of the AAA industry. But either way, they nevertheless ended up crafting one of the most compelling stories that I've ever played in a AAA game, and they did so through subtle yet smart writing that leaned into that old saying of show, don't tell, instead of relying on more traditional storytelling elements such as long cutscenes, a convoluted backstory, or flashy action set pieces. And while I'm not trying to say that this show don't tell style of writing is the only way you can properly go about writing a video game story, I often find myself wishing that AAA games specifically would learn something from this way of telling a story. Doom 2016 proved that you can center the gameplay and still have a compelling and complex story without convoluted setups that would detract from the main gameplay experience. But then they retraced their steps when it came to Doom Eternal, and in doing so, they simply fell into a different trap when it comes to the process of telling a story in a game. The trap of thinking that using entries in a menu to separate gameplay from story is any better than employing something like exposition-heavy cutscenes. The truth is that after seeing the very different styles that Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal take towards their storytelling craft, I am uncertain as to what the future of Doom holds, at least when it comes to the question of how future games in the franchise will approach their narrative elements, as I am sure that their gameplay will continue to get even better. But if there is one thing that Doom 2016 has showed us is that there can be more to these types of games. It is that Doom can be more. That it can be both a story game and a Doom game. Ask any gamer out there and they'll probably tell you that Doom is one of the most influential franchises in gaming, not only as it relates to the genre of first-person shooters, but within the medium of video games as a whole. And yet, after Doom 2016, I'd like to believe that the legacy of Doom has grown to encompass more than just its gameplay. I think that Doom 2016's brilliant approach to storytelling has already and will continue to inspire countless other games, even outside the genre of first-person shooters. The opening level of Doom 2016 has become iconic not only because it was a refreshing return to gameplay-centered game design, but because the way in which it introduces the Doom Slayer and Samuel Hayden is truly fascinating and stands as a great example of video game storytelling, one that has obviously resonated with a lot of people. When I was looking up information about boomer shooters for the purpose of this video, I got the feeling at times that a big part of the growing interest in the subgenre of boomer shooters seems to be fueled by nothing but a toxic sense of nostalgia, a desire to go back to a golden age when games and everything else were better. The same sense of nostalgia that'll have some sections of the gaming community complaining about the woke agenda in the gaming industry, which, now that I think about it, is probably what originated the boomer part of the name in the first place. And yet, there is a moment that stuck with me when I was reading the article by Hugo that I mentioned earlier. Hugo decides to end the article on a reaffirming note, saying that, quote, overall, the boomer shooter movement has resulted in a few well-executed explorations within an older form. It's encouraged a newfound curiosity in re-evaluating groundbreaking games from the past, charting possible futures for ideas that might have only been realized across a small handful of titles. This perspective is anything but regressive. It's imaginative and transformative. And this is how I feel about Doom 2016. Not just in terms of its gameplay, but its style of storytelling too. Doom 2016 hooked me in through its smart and compelling writing. It hooked me in because it is a game that tackles themes such as capitalism and work culture in a surprisingly adept and deep manner, something that I would have never expected a game like Doom to do. I have never really been into first-person shooters in general, and before playing Doom 2016, I would have never imagined that I'd be interested in Doom in the slightest, and yet here I am now, waiting to see what the future of the franchise holds. If there is one thing I've learned through watching the Noclip documentary, as well as countless other interviews and video analyses, is that the developers behind Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal are truly passionate about the games they make and about the potential that lies within the Doom franchise as a whole. As such, I know that they will continue to build upon the already mesmerizing gameplay loop of Doom Eternal in new and creative ways. My only hope, however, is that future Doom games will also learn from and continue to build upon the smart storytelling techniques present in Doom 2016, which, in its efforts to go against the soulless and uninspired conventions of the AAA gaming industry, prove that there are smarter ways in which games can bring together story and gameplay that go beyond the simple idea of having to sacrifice one for the sake of the other.
You think the only way is to kill them all, leave nothing behind. And you may be right. But we can't just shut it all down. Without Argent energy, it will be worse. I don't expect you to agree. But with this, we can continue our work. I am not the villain in this story. I do what I do because there is no choice.
Rerouting tether coordinates complete.
Our time is up. I can't kill you, but I won't have you standing in our way. Until we see each other again.